8 years ago, on a clear Saturday morning in October, Michael Torres kissed his wife goodbye, grabbed his hiking boots, and drove to Black Ridge Trail, a route he had walked dozens of times before. By sunset, he had vanished. His truck sat locked at the trailhead, wallet untouched inside. 2 miles in, search teams found his day pack sitting upright beside the trail, perfectly intact, his phone still charged but deliberately powered off. No footprints led into the woods, no signs of struggle, no blood, no body. The trail went silent. Over the years, Black Ridge became a place people whispered about, a beautiful path now shadowed by unanswered questions. His family waited. Investigators moved on. The case grew cold. Then, 8 years and 2 months later, a group of backcountry hikers stumbled into a remote canyon 7 miles off any marked trail and found something that would shatter everything they thought they knew. Michael Torres woke up on October 14th, the same way he had every Saturday for the past 3 years. The alarm buzzed softly at 6 in the morning, and he reached over to silence it before it could wake Elena. The bedroom was still dim, the early autumn light just beginning to seep through the curtains. He dressed quietly in layers, a moisture-wicking shirt, fleece pullover, his worn-in hiking pants that had seen more trails than he could count. His boots waited by the front door, laces loosened from the last hike, soles still caked with dried mud from Black Ridge Trail. Michael Torres was 42 years old, a high school geography teacher at Pine Valley High, and by all accounts, a man who lived a simple, predictable life. He coached the junior varsity soccer team in the fall, attended every parent-teacher conference, never missed his daughter Claire's choir concerts or his son David's basketball games. His colleagues described him as dependable, warm, the kind of teacher students remembered years later. His wife, Elena, a pediatric nurse at the county hospital, had been married to him for 19 years. They had their routines, their quiet rhythms. Saturday mornings belonged to Michael and the mountains. Black Ridge Trail was his sanctuary. A moderate 12-mile loop through dense pine forest and open ridgeline, it offered sweeping views of the valley below and enough solitude to clear his head after a week of lesson plans and teenage drama. He had hiked it more than 50 times. He knew every switchback, every rocky outcrop, every place where the trail narrowed and the drop-off required careful footing. It was not a dangerous hike. It was not remote in the way that true backcountry is remote. On weekends, you would pass other hikers, trail runners, the occasional mountain biker. It was the kind of place people brought their dogs. That morning, Michael made himself coffee in the kitchen while Elena stirred awake upstairs. He packed his day pack methodically. 2 water bottles, a handful of energy bars, a first aid kit he had carried for years and never needed, his phone fully charged, a lightweight rain jacket just in case. The weather forecast called for clear skies and temperatures in the low 60s. Perfect hiking weather. He scribbled a note on the whiteboard by the fridge. Black Ridge, back by 4, love you. He kissed Elena on the cheek when she came downstairs in her bathrobe, still half asleep. She smiled at him, told him to be careful, and watched him walk out the front door. It was 7:15 in the morning. Michael's truck, a silver Chevy Silverado with a dent in the rear bumper and a Pine Valley High parking pass hanging from the rearview mirror, pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the quiet suburban street. Elena poured herself coffee and settled onto the couch with a book. The house was peaceful. Claire was still asleep upstairs. David had slept over at a friend's house the night before. It was a normal Saturday. Unremarkable. Forgettable. By 4:30 that afternoon, Elena began checking her phone. Michael was usually punctual, sometimes even early. By 5, she felt the first flutter of concern. She texted him, "You close?" No response. She tried calling. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. She told herself he was probably out of service, maybe running late, maybe he had decided to take a longer route. By 6, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the living room windows. She called again, voicemail. She tried not to panic. Claire came downstairs and asked where Dad was. Elena said he was probably on his way. By 7, the concern had hardened into something sharper. Elena called Michael's friend Greg, another teacher who sometimes hiked with him. Greg hadn't heard from him. She called the ranger station. No one had reported any incidents on Black Ridge Trail. By 8, It was fully dark outside, and Elena stood in the driveway staring at the empty space where Michael's truck should have been. Her hands shook as she dialed again. Voicemail. At 9:30, she called David and told him to come home. At 10, she started searching online for what to do when someone doesn't come back from a hike. At 11:45, she called the sheriff's office. The dispatcher was calm, practiced. "Adults go missing on trails all the time," she said. "Most of them turn up within a few hours. Twisted ankle, got turned around, lost track of time. They would send a patrol car to check the trailhead. Elena should stay by the phone. If he didn't turn up by morning, they would escalate." Elena sat in the kitchen under the fluorescent lights, her phone clutched in both hands, and waited. Claire sat beside her, silent and pale. David paced the hallway. None of them slept. At dawn, when the first patrol deputy arrived at Black Ridge Trailhead, he found Michael's truck exactly where it should have been. It was locked. The windows were rolled up. Inside, sitting on the passenger seat, was Michael's wallet, his driver's license, credit cards, $60 in cash, all untouched. The deputy radioed it in. By 7 in the morning, a search and rescue operation was being organized. By 9, the trailhead parking lot was filled with vehicles, sheriff's deputies, volunteer search teams, paramedics, a search and rescue coordinator. Elena, Claire, and David arrived shortly after, their faces drawn and hollow from a sleepless night. Elena gave them a recent photo of Michael, described what he was wearing: gray fleece, dark green hiking pants, a black baseball cap. She told them he was experienced, careful, not reckless. The coordinator nodded and assured her they would find him. The search began in earnest just after 10. Teams spread out along Black Ridge Trail in both directions, calling Michael's name, scanning the forest on either side of the path. Tracking dogs were brought in, given Michael's scent from a shirt Elena had brought from home. Volunteers walked slowly, methodically, eyes sweeping the underbrush for any sign, a piece of clothing, a footprint, anything. The weather was clear, visibility good. If Michael had been injured and was lying somewhere visible from the trail, they would find him quickly. But they didn't. By early afternoon, the search had covered the first 5 miles of the trail in both directions. Nothing, no trace. The dogs seemed confused, circling and pulling in different directions, but never locking onto a clear scent trail beyond the parking lot. A helicopter arrived just after 2, equipped with thermal imaging technology. It swept back and forth over the forest canopy, searching for heat signatures. Nothing. As the hours stretched on, the initial optimism began to erode. Searchers radioed in updates. No sign, no sign, no sign. Elena stood near the trailhead with Claire and David, wrapped in jackets against the cooling air, her eyes fixed on the tree line as if willing Michael to walk out of the forest. At 4:30 in the afternoon, 36 hours after Michael had set out on his hike, a volunteer searcher named Tom Castillo found something. He was 2 miles up the trail, moving slowly, checking both sides of the path. There, sitting upright on a flat rock just off the trail, was a day pack. It was dusty, slightly faded from the sun, but otherwise intact. Tom called it in immediately. Within minutes, the area was swarmed by search personnel and deputies. They photographed it from every angle before anyone touched it. Then, carefully, they opened it. Inside the pack, everything was still there. 2 water bottles, one still half full. Energy bars, unopened. A first aid kit, unused. A rain jacket, neatly folded. And a phone, Michael's phone. The screen was black. One of the deputies pressed the power button. Nothing. The phone was off. Not dead off. Deliberately powered down. The battery still held 40% charge when they later turned it on at the sheriff's station. The discovery sent a cold shock through everyone present. An experienced hiker does not abandon his pack in perfect condition. He does not turn off his phone and leave it behind. The pack was sitting upright, as if placed there intentionally, not dropped or discarded in panic. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no scuff marks in the dirt suggesting a confrontation or a fall. The pack was simply there, 2 miles into a 12-mile loop, as if Michael had stopped, set it down, and walked away. Search efforts intensified immediately. If Michael had continued without his pack, he might be disoriented, dehydrated, injured. The dogs were brought to the spot where the pack was found. They sniffed the area, circled, pulled toward the trail ahead for a few dozen yards, and then stopped. The scent trail ended. It was as if Michael had evaporated. Searchers combed the surrounding forest in widening circles. They checked ravines, creek beds, dense thickets where someone might have stumbled and fallen. They found nothing. No footprints leading off trail, no broken branches, no disturbed ground. By nightfall, the search had grown to over 100 people. Floodlights were set up. Teams continued searching through the night, though the coordinator knew the chances of finding someone alive after this long were dropping with every passing hour. Elena refused to leave the trailhead. She sat in a folding chair someone had brought, a blanket around her shoulders, staring into the darkness. Claire and David sat beside her, silent and numb. Volunteers brought them coffee, sandwiches. They barely touched any of it. The next morning, the search expanded further. Dive teams were brought in to check nearby lakes and rivers. Helicopters continued sweeping the area. The story had begun to spread through the community, and more volunteers arrived, teachers from Pine Valley High, parents of students Michael had taught, neighbors, people who had never met him but felt compelled to help. The trailhead became a base camp, organized chaos, radios crackling, maps spread across truck hoods, teams checking in and out. But the trail remained cold. Investigators began asking different questions. They interviewed Elena at length. When had she last seen Michael? Had they argued recently? Had he seemed upset or distracted? Were there any financial problems? Any reason he might have wanted to disappear? Elena answered every question with growing disbelief and frustration. No, they had not argued. No, there were no financial problems. No, Michael would never leave his family. She could see the suspicion forming in their eyes, and it made her feel sick. Detectives examined Michael's phone records, his bank accounts, his computer. They found nothing unusual. No secret emails, no unexplained withdrawals, no evidence of an affair or a hidden life. Michael Torres appeared to be exactly who everyone said he was: a devoted husband, a dedicated father, a reliable teacher, a man with no reason to vanish. By the end of the first week, the official search began to scale back. The coordinator explained to Elena that they had covered every accessible inch of the trail and surrounding area multiple times. If Michael was out there and still alive, he would have been found by now. The grim reality was settling in. Either Michael had somehow left the area entirely, or he was dead and his body was hidden somewhere they hadn't looked. Elena stood in the parking lot as volunteers packed up equipment, as the helicopters flew away for the last time, and felt the ground shift beneath her. This was not how it was supposed to end. There was supposed to be an answer. A body. Something. The days blurred together after that. Search efforts continued on a smaller scale. Dedicated volunteers, weekend searches organized by the community, flyers posted in trailheads across the county. Michael's face stared out from telephone poles and bulletin boards. Missing. Last seen October 14th. Please call with any information. Tips trickled in. Someone thought they saw a man matching his description at a gas station 2 towns over. It turned out to be someone else. A psychic called Elena and claimed Michael was alive and living in Canada. Elena hung up. Detective Sarah Brennan, a 15-year veteran of the county sheriff's office, was assigned as the lead investigator. She was methodical, patient, and deeply unsettled by the case. She had worked missing person cases before, and there was always something, a direction the person had gone, a reason they had left, a body eventually found. This case had none of that. It was a void. She retraced Michael's steps obsessively, interviewed everyone who knew him, searched for patterns. She found nothing that made sense. 2 weeks after Michael disappeared, the case was officially reclassified as a cold missing person investigation. Active search operations ceased. The story faded from the front page of the local newspaper. Life, as it always does, moved on. But for Elena, Claire, and David, time stopped on October 14th. They were trapped in a place where grief could not complete itself, where hope and despair coexisted in unbearable tension, where every knock on the door might be news, where every phone call might be the one that brought him back, or confirmed he was gone forever. And so they waited, suspended in the terrible silence of not knowing. The search for Michael Torres became one of the largest volunteer efforts the county had seen in years, but as the days stretched into weeks, It also became one of the most frustrating. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging technology swept back and forth over the wilderness surrounding Black Ridge Trail, scanning thousands of acres of dense pine forest, rocky ridges, and steep ravines. Dive teams were deployed to nearby lakes and rivers, probing the cold, murky water for any sign of a body. Volunteers organized into grid search teams walked shoulder to shoulder through the forest, eyes fixed on the ground, calling Michael's name until their voices went hoarse. But the wilderness gave them nothing. Investigators found no footprints leading off the established trail beyond the point where Michael's daypack had been discovered, no clothing fibers snagged on branches, no disturbances in the underbrush that might indicate someone had pushed through. The forest floor, covered in pine needles and dry leaves, should have shown some sign of passage, but it was as if Michael had simply ceased to exist 2 miles into his hike. The tracking dogs, which had initially seemed promising, lost his scent at the exact location where the pack was found. They circled the area, noses to the ground, and then sat down, confused. One handler explained to Detective Brennan that this sometimes happened when a scent was contaminated or when the person had been picked up by a vehicle, but there were no roads within miles of that spot. The trail was accessible only on foot. Bizarre details began to emerge as investigators dug deeper. A trail camera, installed by the Forest Service half a mile ahead of where the pack was found, had captured images throughout the day Michael went missing. The camera was motion-activated and time-stamped. Investigators reviewed every frame. They saw hikers passing through that afternoon, a couple with a golden retriever at 1:15, a solo trail runner at 2:30, a group of 3 young women at 3:45, but Michael never appeared. If he had continued forward from where his pack was found, the camera should have captured him. It didn't. The implications were chilling. Either Michael had turned back, left the trail entirely, or something had happened to him before he reached that camera. A witness came forward during the second week of the search. A man named Dale Pritchard, who had been at the Black Ridge trailhead the morning Michael disappeared, told investigators he remembered seeing someone matching Michael's description in the parking area around 8 that morning. But Pritchard added a detail that made everyone pause. The man had been talking to someone near a dark green SUV. Pritchard couldn't recall details about the other person, just that they had been standing near the vehicle, appeared to be having a conversation. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time. People talked in parking lots all the time. But now, with Michael missing, the memory took on a darker significance. Detectives immediately tried to track down the dark green SUV. They reviewed parking lot records, though the trailhead didn't have cameras. They put out a public appeal for anyone who had been at Black Ridge that morning to come forward. They ran queries through vehicle registration databases, looking for green SUVs registered to anyone in the area. The leads went nowhere. No one else remembered seeing the vehicle. No one came forward to identify themselves as the person Michael had been talking to. The SUV became a ghost, a possible clue that evaporated under scrutiny. As the investigation continued, the focus inevitably shifted toward Elena and the family. It was standard procedure, Detective Brennan explained gently, but that didn't make it any less painful. Investigators asked probing, uncomfortable questions. Had Michael ever talked about leaving? Had he been depressed? Were there any affairs? Any secrets? Elena answered with as much patience as she could muster, but she could feel the suspicion creeping in. She knew how these things worked. She had watched enough true crime documentaries. The spouse was always the first suspect. She submitted to a polygraph test voluntarily, desperate to remove any doubt. She passed. Investigators examined the family's finances and found nothing unusual. No large withdrawals, no hidden accounts. Michael's life insurance policy was modest. There was no financial motive, but the questions didn't stop. Detectives interviewed Michael's colleagues at Pine Valley High, his friends, even casual acquaintances. They were searching for cracks, inconsistencies, anything that might suggest Michael had been planning to disappear. They found none. Everyone described the same person: reliable, kind, dedicated to his family. A man who loved teaching, who looked forward to his Saturday hikes, who had no apparent reason to abandon his life. The media picked up the story in the third week. Local news stations ran segments about the missing teacher, showing footage of the search efforts and interviews with tearful volunteers. The story spread to regional outlets. then national. Michael's face appeared on missing person websites, social media pages dedicated to unsolved disappearances. And with the media attention came the online sleuths, amateur detectives who combed through every detail, constructed elaborate theories, and posted them on forums and message boards. Some of the theories were plausible. Others were absurd. A disturbing number of them accused Elena of involvement, dissecting her demeanor in news interviews, claiming her tears seemed fake, her body language suspicious. Elena stopped reading the comments after someone posted her home address and suggested people should investigate her themselves. By the time the official search efforts scaled back at the 2-week mark, the community was exhausted and bewildered. A vigil was held at Pine Valley High, attended by hundreds of students, parents, and faculty. Candles flickered in the darkening evening as people shared memories of Michael, told stories about his terrible puns in class, his enthusiasm for geography trivia, the way he stayed after school to help struggling students. Claire and David stood beside their mother, faces blank with shock. Elena tried to speak but couldn't get through more than a few sentences before breaking down. Someone else finished reading her statement. "We just want him to come home. Please, if anyone knows anything, please come forward." But no one came forward with answers. The tips that continued to trickle in led nowhere. Someone claimed to have seen Michael at a rest stop in Nevada. Investigators checked surveillance footage. It wasn't him. Another caller insisted Michael had been spotted getting on a bus in Arizona. That lead also evaporated. A particularly cruel hoax involved someone calling Elena and claiming to be Michael, saying he was alive and would explain everything soon. The call was traced to a teenager 3 states away who thought it was funny. Detective Brennan personally delivered the news to Elena and watched the hope drain from her face once again. The case file grew thicker, but no clearer. Detective Brennan reviewed it obsessively, late into the night, searching for something she had missed. She drove out to Black Ridge Trail on her days off, walked the route herself, stood at the spot where the daypack had been found, and tried to imagine what could have happened. She interviewed the volunteer who had found the pack multiple times, asking if he had noticed anything else, any detail he might have forgotten. He had nothing more to give her. She brought in a forensic team to re-examine the pack and its contents. They found no fingerprints other than Michael's, no foreign DNA, no trace evidence that pointed to another person. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered that search dogs had lost Michael's scent not because it disappeared, but because it stopped. Canine handlers explained that this usually indicated one of several scenarios. The person had gotten into a vehicle, the person had died and the scent dissipated, or the scent had been intentionally masked. None of these explanations fit the location. There were no roads. If Michael had died right there, his body should have been nearby. And who would mask a scent in the middle of a hiking trail? As autumn turned to winter, the forest became treacherous. Snow covered the trails, making further searches nearly impossible. The investigation didn't stop, but it slowed. Detective Brennan continued following leads, re-interviewing witnesses, checking for connections to other cases. She discovered that 2 other men had vanished in the region over the past decade, one 6 years prior, another 9 years before that. Both had been solo hikers. Both had disappeared without a trace. She spent weeks investigating possible connections, looking for patterns, anything that might suggest a serial predator operating in the area. But the cases were too different, too spread out. One of the men had eventually been found dead at the bottom of a ravine, an apparent fall. The other remained missing, but had a history of mental illness and was believed to have intentionally vanished. The connections were tenuous at best. The family, meanwhile, learned to live in a state of permanent suspension. Elena took a leave of absence from work, unable to focus. She spent her days at home, jumping every time the phone rang, staring at Michael's empty chair at the dinner table. Claire, who had been planning to attend college out of state, decided to stay local so she could be close to home. David stopped playing basketball, stopped seeing his friends. He would sit in his father's home office for hours, surrounded by Michael's books and maps, as if proximity to his father's things might somehow bring him back. The holidays were unbearable. Thanksgiving came and went with an empty seat at the table. Christmas was worse. Elena couldn't bring herself to decorate. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks exploded in the distance, the family sat together in silence, marking the passage into a year that Michael would not see unless he was out there somewhere, alive, for reasons none of them could fathom. By the time the snow melted and spring arrived, Michael Torres had been missing for 6 months. The case was cold. Detective Brennan kept the file on her desk, but there was nowhere left to look, no new leads to follow. The community's attention had shifted to other tragedies, other news. Michael's missing person flyers were faded and torn, barely visible on the bulletin boards where they still hung. The trail reopened for the season, and hikers returned, most of them unaware of the man who had vanished there. Elena started attending a support group for families of missing persons, sitting in a circle with others who understood the unique torture of not knowing, of being unable to grieve because grief required an ending, and there was no ending. There was only the question that echoed through every day, every sleepless night. Where is he? 3 years after Michael Torres disappeared, the family still lived in the house where he had kissed Elena goodbye that October morning, still kept his belongings exactly as he had left them, still half expected him to walk through the front door with some impossible explanation for where he had been. But as time stretched on, that expectation faded into something quieter and more painful, a dull, permanent ache that never quite went away. Elena had returned to work at the hospital, though her colleagues noticed she was different now, quieter, more distant. She went through the motions of her shifts, caring for sick children with the same professionalism she had always shown, but something essential had been hollowed out of her. She couldn't bring herself to have Michael declared legally dead. The paperwork sat in a folder on her kitchen counter for months before she finally shoved it into a drawer. Declaring him dead felt like betrayal, like giving up. As long as his status remained missing, there was still a sliver of possibility. Claire was in her junior year at the State University 40 miles from home, majoring in criminal justice. She told people she had chosen the field because she wanted to help others, but the truth was more specific. She wanted to understand what had happened to her father. She spent hours in the library reading case files of unsolved disappearances, studying search and rescue protocols, learning about forensic analysis. She joined online communities dedicated to missing persons cases, contributing theories and research. Her professors noticed her intensity, the way she fixated on cold cases during class discussions. One of them pulled her aside after class and gently suggested she might be too personally invested. Claire thanked her and ignored the advice. David was a senior in high school now, counting down the days until graduation. He had become withdrawn, sullen. He had stopped talking about his father entirely, refused to attend the annual memorial vigils the community still held each October. When people asked about his dad, he gave short, clipped answers and changed the subject. His grades had slipped. He spent most of his time in his room, headphones on, shutting out the world. Elena worried about him constantly, but her attempts to reach him were met with shrugs and silence. Grief had calcified into anger in David, and he didn't know what to do with it. Detective Sarah Brennan had been promoted to sergeant, but she never fully closed the Torres case in her mind. She kept the file in her office, pulled it out every few months, reviewed the evidence, the witness statements, the search reports. She had worked dozens of cases since Michael's disappearance, but this one stayed with her. It violated the logic she relied on as an investigator. People didn't just vanish. There was always evidence, always a trail, always something. The absence of answers felt like a personal failure. She periodically re-interviewed key witnesses, hoping that time might shake loose a forgotten detail. She checked missing person databases regularly, looking for pattern matches with other cases. During one of these searches, she noticed something that made her pause. Within a 60-mile radius of Black Ridge Trail, 2 other men had vanished over the past decade, both experienced hikers, both solo, both without a trace. She had looked into these cases before, but now she dug deeper, searching for connections she might have missed. The first case involved a man named Robert Chen, age 38, who disappeared 7 years before Michael. He had been hiking alone on Silver Point Trail, about 40 miles northeast of Black Ridge. His car was found at the trailhead. His belongings were eventually discovered scattered near a creek, but his body was never found. The official conclusion was that he had fallen, been injured, and succumbed to the elements, with his remains carried away by animals or water. But the details troubled Detective Brennan like Michael. Robert had been an experienced hiker. Like Michael, there were inconsistencies in where his belongings were found versus where he should have been. The second case was older, from 10 years prior. A man named James Rucker, 45, had vanished on Canyon Ridge Trail. He was found 6 months later, his body at the bottom of a steep ravine, death ruled accidental. But Detective Brennan read through the autopsy report and found notes from the medical examiner indicating some uncertainty about the injuries, fractures, that could have been from a fall, but also could have been from blunt force trauma. She spent weeks trying to find connections between the three men. Had they known each other? Attended the same school? Worked in the same field? Visited the same places? She found nothing. The cases were too different, the timelines too spread out, the locations too varied. If there was a predator targeting solo male hikers, they were exceptionally careful and patient. More likely, she concluded reluctantly, these were three separate tragedies with no connection beyond bad luck and the inherent dangers of wilderness. But the doubt lingered. Back in the community, theories about Michael's disappearance had calcified into local lore. Some believed he had been attacked by a mountain lion or bear, though no animal activity had been found at the scene. Others thought he had fallen into an unmapped cave system or sinkhole. The region's geology included underground water channels, and it was possible, though unlikely, that Michael had stumbled into one and his body was simply irretrievable. The more cynical believed Michael had orchestrated his own disappearance, that he was living somewhere under a different name, free from the responsibilities of his previous life. Elena heard this theory repeated in hushed tones at the grocery store, saw it posted on internet forums, and it made her feel ill every time. There were darker theories too, whispers about foul play, about someone Michael knew, someone who had a grudge. But no suspects had ever emerged, no evidence of conflict in Michael's life. He hadn't been involved in anything dangerous or controversial. He was a geography teacher. He coached soccer. He was, by all accounts, unremarkable in the safest sense of the word. Elena attended monthly support group meetings for families of missing persons, held in the basement of a community center in town. The group was small, usually 6 or 7 people, all of them carrying the same unbearable weight. There was Janet, whose adult son had vanished 3 years ago after saying he was going out for cigarettes. There was Marcus, whose wife had disappeared during a business trip to another state. There was an elderly man named Bill, whose brother had been missing for 15 years. They sat in a circle, drank bad coffee from styrofoam cups, and shared the things they couldn't say to anyone else. The guilt, the anger, the irrational hope that wouldn't die, no matter how much time passed. Elena found a strange comfort in their company. These were people who understood that grief without a body was a special kind of torture. They understood the constant tension between needing answers and dreading them. They understood the horrible limbo of not being able to move forward, unable to grieve properly because grief required finality. The anniversaries were the worst. Every October 14th, the local newspaper would run a small story. 3 years since Michael Torres vanished, or still missing, family seeks closure in Torres case. A group of volunteers would return to Black Ridge Trail and conduct a search, more symbolic than practical at this point. Elena, Claire, and David would stand at the trailhead while strangers walked the path their husband and father had walked, calling his name into the indifferent forest. By year 5, the anniversary stories stopped appearing in the newspaper. The volunteer searches dwindled. People stopped asking Elena how she was holding up. Life, which had paused for a moment when Michael disappeared, had fully resumed around them. The world moved on. But the Torres family remained frozen, trapped in October 14th, unable to escape. Claire graduated college with honors and immediately applied to the police academy. She told her mother it was what she wanted, but Elena knew the truth. Claire was still searching for her father, just in a different way. David graduated high school and left for college as quickly as he could, choosing a school on the opposite side of the country. He needed distance, needed to be somewhere his father's absence wasn't a constant presence. Detective Brennan, now Lieutenant Brennan, was assigned to other cases, other investigations, but she still pulled out the Torres file once or twice a year. She still drove out to Black Ridge Trail occasionally, walked the path to the spot where the day pack had been found, and stood there trying to understand. The forest offered no answers. By year 8, Michael Torres had become something else entirely. He was no longer a missing person in any practical sense. He was a ghost story, a cautionary tale told by hikers around campfires. New residents of the town had never heard of him. His missing person posters had long since disappeared from public spaces. The case was as cold as any case could be, a question mark that would never be answered. Elena had finally, reluctantly, begun the process of having Michael declared legally dead, not because she believed he was gone, but because the financial and legal complications of his absence had become unmanageable. And then, 8 years and 2 months after Michael Torres walked into the forest and disappeared, something happened that would tear open the wound all over again and force everyone to confront the possibility that his disappearance had never been an accident at all. Late September brought the kind of weather that made experienced hikers feel alive. The brutal heat of summer had faded, replaced by crisp mornings and clear skies. A group of 4 friends, all in their 30s, all seasoned backcountry enthusiasts, had planned this trip for months. They were attempting a challenging route through Ridgeline Canyon, a remote and rugged area about 7 miles northeast of Black Ridge Trail. This wasn't a place casual hikers visited. There were no marked trails, no signs, no amenities. Getting there required hours of difficult navigation through dense forest and steep, unstable terrain. It was the kind of place you went specifically to get away from people. The group had set out early that morning, carrying multi-day packs, GPS units, and detailed topographical maps. They were experienced enough to know the risks and prepared enough to mitigate them. By early afternoon, they had descended into a narrow ravine carved by a seasonal creek that had long since dried up. The walls of the ravine were steep, studded with jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. One of the hikers, a woman named Jessica Morales, noticed something odd wedged between 2 large boulders near the dried creek bed. At first, she thought it was just debris, maybe an old tarp someone had left behind, or trash that had blown in. But as she got closer, she realized it was fabric, weathered, sun-bleached, partially buried under rocks and sediment. She called out to the others. They approached carefully. The fabric was attached to what appeared to be the frame of a backpack, the kind hikers used decades ago, metal frame, canvas straps, mostly deteriorated. Near it, half buried in the dirt, were more items. A piece of clothing, so faded and damaged it was hard to identify. A wristwatch, the crystal cracked, the band broken, and then, as they carefully moved some of the smaller rocks, they found something that made Jessica's breath catch in her throat. Bones. Partial skeletal remains, scattered and incomplete, clearly disturbed by animals over a long period. A skull, partially intact, resting against the base of a boulder. No one spoke for a long moment. Then one of the men, Tom Herrera, pulled out his satellite phone and called 911. His hands shook as he described what they had found and gave their GPS coordinates. The dispatcher told them not to touch anything else, to move back from the area, and to wait. Help was coming. It took nearly 2 hours for the first sheriff's deputies to reach the location, and they had to be guided in by Tom using GPS coordinates. The terrain was too rough for vehicles. By the time Detective Lieutenant Sarah Brennan arrived, along with forensic technicians and a medical examiner, the sun was beginning to set. They set up floodlights powered by portable generators and began the painstaking process of documenting the scene. The remains were in poor condition, as expected after years of exposure to the elements. Scattered by animals, bleached by the sun, partially buried by sediment. But there was enough. The forensic team carefully collected every fragment, every piece of clothing, every potential piece of evidence. They bagged the broken watch, the deteriorated backpack frame, scraps of fabric. They photographed everything from multiple angles, mapped the exact location of each item. It would take 2 full days to complete the recovery. The area was too remote to transport everything out at once, so teams made multiple trips, carrying equipment and evidence back through miles of difficult terrain. Local news stations picked up the story quickly. Human remains found in remote canyon. But at this point, identification was uncertain. It could be anyone, a hiker who had gone missing decades ago, someone who had died of natural causes and whose death was never reported, even possibly someone who had been the victim of a crime far from where they disappeared. The remains were transported to the state forensics lab. Dental records and DNA testing would be required for positive identification. The broken watch was examined, though damaged. The engraving on the back was still partially legible. To Michael, happy 40th. A chill went through the examination room when the forensic technician noted that detail in the report. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan felt it in her gut before the confirmation came. She pulled the missing person files for the region, cross-referenced men who had disappeared in the past 15 years. 3 names stood out: Robert Chen, James Rucker, and Michael Torres. She requested dental records and DNA samples from the families of all 3. Elena Torres had provided DNA samples 8 years ago during the original investigation, kept on file for exactly this purpose. The comparison took less than a week. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Lieutenant Brennan answered, listened in silence, thanked the forensic specialist, and hung up. She sat at her desk for a long moment, staring at the case file that had haunted her for 8 years. Then she picked up the phone and made the call she had both hoped and dreaded to make. Elena was at work when her phone rang. She saw the number Sheriff's Department and her heart seized. In 8 years, these calls had come occasionally, always dead end. But something about this one felt different. She stepped into an empty patient room and answered. Lieutenant Brennan's voice was gentle but direct. They had found remains in Ridgeline Canyon. Dental and DNA analysis had confirmed the identity. The remains belonged to Michael Torres. Elena's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the examination table, the phone pressed to her ear, unable to speak. Lieutenant Brennan continued talking, saying something about official procedures, about when the remains would be released, about reopening the investigation. But Elena heard none of it. After 8 years of not knowing, of existing in unbearable limbo, she finally had an answer, and it destroyed her. The news broke nationally within hours. Missing teacher found dead. After 8 years, read the headlines. Remains of Michael Torres discovered in remote canyon. The story was everywhere: cable news, social media, missing persons forums. The small town was once again flooded with media attention. News vans parked outside the Torres home, reporters trying to get statements from the family. Claire drove home immediately from the police academy where she was training. David flew back from college. The family met with Lieutenant Brennan and members of the investigative team in a private room at the sheriff's office. The lieutenant explained what they knew. Michael's remains had been found approximately 7 miles from Black Ridge Trail, in an area with no established hiking paths, in a location he would have had no reason to be. The condition of the remains made determining cause of death extremely difficult, but there were signs of possible trauma to the skeletal structure. The case was no longer a missing person investigation. It was now officially a suspicious death investigation, potentially a homicide. The questions that had haunted them for 8 years remained, but now they had a different, darker weight. How did Michael get to that remote canyon? Why was he there? And most chillingly, what had happened to him? The forensic analysis of Michael Torres's remains became the focus of a reinvigorated investigation that moved with an urgency absent from the cold case it had been for nearly a decade. Forensic anthropologists at the State Crime Lab worked meticulously, examining every bone fragment, every piece of evidence recovered from Ridgeline Canyon. Their findings would be crucial, but the condition of the remains meant that definitive answers would be elusive. The anthropologists determined that death had occurred approximately 8 years prior, consistent with the timeline of Michael's disappearance. Decomposition and skeletal weathering patterns supported this estimation, but determining cause of death was far more complicated. The skeleton showed evidence of trauma. Several ribs on the left side showed fractures, and there was a depressed fracture on the left side of the skull above the temporal bone. But were these injuries the cause of death? Or had they occurred after death, perhaps from rockfall or animal activity? Dr. Patricia Nguyen, the forensic pathologist reviewing the case, noted in her report that the pattern of rib fractures could be consistent with blunt force trauma from a physical altercation or from a significant fall. The skull fracture was more concerning. It suggested a forceful impact, potentially fatal. However, Dr. Nguyen also noted that without soft tissue, without being able to examine bleeding patterns or brain trauma, it was impossible to say with certainty whether the skull fracture occurred before or after death. Animals had scattered the remains over a wide area. Years of weathering had degraded the bones. The report concluded with frustrating ambiguity. Cause of death, undetermined. Manner of death, suspicious circumstances. This uncertainty was maddening to investigators, but it was the reality of working with remains that had been exposed to the elements for 8 years. What they could say with certainty was where Michael had been found, and that location raised profound questions. Ridgeline Canyon was 7 miles northeast of Black Ridge Trail, accessible only through extremely difficult terrain. There were no trails leading to it, no reason for a casual day hiker to venture there. The area required technical navigation, physical endurance, and specific intent to reach. Lieutenant Brennan assembled a team to retrace Michael's possible route from where his day pack had been found to where his body was discovered. They brought in expert trackers, search and rescue specialists with decades of experience. The consensus was sobering. There was no logical route Michael could have taken on his own. The terrain between the two locations was brutal, steep ravines, dense forest, unstable ground. A solo hiker without proper equipment would have had extreme difficulty navigating it, and Michael had left his day pack, his water, his supplies behind. Why would an experienced hiker attempt an extremely difficult off-trail route without his gear? The investigation took on new intensity. Lieutenant Brennan reopened the original case file and began retracing every lead, re-interviewing every witness. She discovered something that had been overlooked 8 years ago, buried in the mountain of initial witness statements. A retired park ranger named Vernon Hayes had been casually interviewed during the early days of the search, but hadn't been considered significant at the time. He had mentioned seeing a hiker that day who he thought might have been in the general area, but he hadn't been specific about the location or time. When Lieutenant Brennan tracked down Vernon Hayes, now 71 and living in a retirement community 2 hours away, and showed him Michael's photograph, his eyes widened with recognition. He remembered, not from the trail, but from a service road that ran along the eastern edge of the forest, about 3 miles from Black Ridge Trail. He had been driving along that road around midday when he saw a man matching Michael's description. The man had appeared disoriented, standing on the side of the road, and was talking to someone near a vehicle. Vernon had slowed down, considered stopping to ask if everything was okay, but the man had gotten into the vehicle and they had driven away. He thought nothing of it at the time. People used those service roads occasionally to access remote areas. This revelation was explosive. If Vernon's memory was accurate, it meant Michael had left Black Ridge Trail, somehow made it to a service road 3 miles away, and gotten into a vehicle with another person. This completely contradicted the assumption that Michael had simply wandered off into the wilderness and become lost or injured. Lieutenant Brennan pressed Vernon for details. What kind of vehicle? What did the other person look like? Vernon struggled to remember. It had been 8 years, and he hadn't thought it was important at the time. He thought the vehicle was an SUV, maybe dark-colored, green, possibly. He couldn't recall any features of the other person, just that there had been someone there, talking to the man he now realized had been Michael Torres. The dark green SUV. The same description from the original witness at Black Ridge Trailhead parking lot. Lieutenant Brennan felt the pieces shifting, forming a pattern she couldn't quite see yet. She went back through the original witness statements and found the report from Dale Pritchard, who had claimed to see Michael talking to someone near a dark green SUV in the parking area. But when she re-interviewed Dale and showed him maps of the area, asking him to pinpoint exactly where he had been and where the interaction took place, Dale became less certain. He had assumed it was at the Black Ridge Trailhead because that's where everyone parked, but when pressed, he admitted he might have been confused about the exact location. It had been early morning. He had been on his way to a different trail. He might have actually seen the interaction at one of the other access points nearby. Lieutenant Brennan obtained maps showing all the service roads and access points in the region. One of them, approximately 3 miles east of Black Ridge Trail, led into the back country roughly in the direction of Ridgeline Canyon. This access point was rarely used, known mostly to Forest Service personnel and a few locals. If Michael had been at this location, if he had gotten into a vehicle there, it suggested something far more sinister than a hiking accident. The digital forensics team was brought back in to re-examine Michael's phone and computer, this time with new context. They discovered deleted emails from 3 weeks before his disappearance. The emails had been recovered before, but hadn't seemed significant at the time. They were from Michael's personal email account, messages he had sent to himself, appearing to be drafts he was composing but never sent. The content was vague, fragmented thoughts that suggested stress. Can't keep quiet about this. Need to figure out what to do. This is bigger than I thought. When Lieutenant Brennan showed these emails to Elena, she read them in stunned silence. She had no idea what they referred to. Michael hadn't mentioned anything unusual to her. He hadn't seemed stressed or worried beyond the normal pressures of teaching. But clearly, something had been troubling him. Something significant enough that he was composing unsent messages to himself, perhaps trying to work through his thoughts. Detectives began re-interviewing Michael's colleagues, friends, and acquaintances with these new details in mind. Had Michael mentioned anything unusual? Had he seemed worried, distracted, or frightened in the weeks before he disappeared? Most people had nothing to add. Michael had seemed normal, perhaps a bit tired from the school year, but nothing alarming. But then, a colleague named Jennifer Walsh came forward with something she had forgotten until now. About 2 weeks before Michael disappeared, they had been in the faculty lounge together, and Michael had mentioned something strange. He said he had been receiving notes anonymous, cryptic messages left in his school mailbox. Jennifer had asked what they said, and Michael had been vague, describing them as weird and probably just a prank. He hadn't seemed particularly concerned, so Jennifer had dismissed it and forgotten about it until now. Lieutenant Brennan immediately wanted to see these notes, but they were long gone. The school cleaned out staff mailboxes regularly, and nothing from 8 years ago would have been preserved. Michael had apparently thrown them away, not taking them seriously. But the revelation added another layer to the mystery. Someone had been contacting Michael anonymously before his disappearance, and he had been troubled by something he felt he couldn't keep quiet about. Another friend, Greg Dunham, the colleague Elena, had called the night Michael didn't come home, recalled a conversation from about a month before the disappearance. They had been grabbing beers after a soccer game, and Michael had mentioned feeling like someone was watching him on his recent hikes. Greg had laughed it off, joking about Michael getting paranoid in his old age. Michael had smiled and agreed it was probably nothing, just the weird feeling you sometimes get when you're alone in the woods. But now, in the context of everything else, it took on a darker significance. The investigation was shifting from a missing hiker to something that looked increasingly like foul play. Someone had known Michael's hiking habits. Someone had possibly followed him, contacted him, lured him away from the trail. But who and why? Lieutenant Brennan's team expanded their scope, looking into Michael's life from every angle. They examined his work at the school more closely. Had there been any conflicts, any issues with students or parents? They found nothing significant. They looked into his personal finances again, searching for anything that might suggest he was involved in something he shouldn't have been. Clean. They examined his social media, his email history, his phone records going back months. Nothing raised red flags. But then one of the detectives flagged something in the school district's HR records. 6 months before Michael disappeared, there had been an internal investigation involving another teacher, Kyle Drummond. The investigation concerned allegations of inappropriate conduct with students. Nothing criminal had been proven, but the allegations were serious enough that Drummond had been fired. Michael Torres had been one of several teachers asked to provide statements during the investigation. Lieutenant Brennan pulled the file on Kyle Drummond and began to read, and as she did, a cold certainty began to form. They had their first real suspect. Kyle Drummond's personnel file painted a picture of a man whose career had ended in disgrace and resentment. He had been a social studies teacher at Pine Valley High for 12 years before allegations surfaced that he had been sending inappropriate messages to students and making uncomfortable comments during class. Several students had come forward, and the school district launched an internal investigation. Faculty members were interviewed, including Michael Torres, whose classroom was next to Drummond's and who had observed some of the concerning behavior. According to the investigation records, Michael had provided a detailed statement describing incidents where he had overheard Drummond making comments to female students that crossed professional boundaries. He had also reported that Drummond frequently kept students after class alone, which violated school policy without another adult present. Michael's testimony had been one of several that contributed to the district's decision to terminate Drummond's employment. Drummond had fought the termination, hired a lawyer, threatened to sue the district. But the evidence was sufficient, and his appeal was denied. He was fired in March, 7 months before Michael disappeared in October. According to his last known address in district records, Drummond had moved out of state shortly after his termination. Lieutenant Brennan assigned 2 detectives to track down Kyle Drummond's current whereabouts. It took 3 days, but they located him living in a small town in Oregon, working as a warehouse supervisor. Local authorities were contacted, and Drummond was brought in for questioning. Lieutenant Brennan and Detective Mark Chen drove 8 hours to conduct the interview themselves. Kyle Drummond was 47 years old, heavier than in his faculty photo from years ago, with thinning hair and the guarded expression of someone who had been through legal proceedings before. He sat in the interview room with his lawyer. He had hired one immediately upon being contacted and listened, as Lieutenant Brennan explained why they wanted to talk to him. Drummond's response was measured. Yes, he knew Michael Torres. Yes, he harbored resentment about how things had ended at Pine Valley High. He felt he had been unfairly treated, that Michael and others had exaggerated or misrepresented his interactions with students. But he denied any involvement in Michael's disappearance. He claimed he had never contacted Michael after leaving the school district, had never been anywhere near Black Ridge Trail, and had been at home the day Michael vanished. His alibi was weak. He lived alone. No one could corroborate where he had been that October Saturday 8 years ago. When pressed, he said he had probably been at home, watching football, the kind of thing he did most weekends. It was believable but impossible to verify. Detectives executed a search warrant on Drummond's current residence and vehicle. They were looking for any evidence connecting him to Michael's death, old photos, maps of the area, anything that might suggest he had planned or carried out something violent. They found nothing. His current vehicle was a sedan he had purchased 3 years ago. His home contained the usual accumulation of someone living alone, too much takeout packaging, a depressing bachelor's kitchen, nothing that suggested criminal behavior. But when detectives dug into his vehicle history, they found something significant. 8 years ago, at the time of Michael's disappearance, Kyle Drummond had owned a dark green Ford Explorer. He had sold it 5 years ago, and the vehicle's subsequent history showed it had changed hands twice more before being involved in a serious accident and scrapped for parts. The physical vehicle no longer existed, making forensic analysis impossible. Cell tower data from the day of Michael's disappearance placed Drummond's phone in the general region of Black Ridge Trail, though not precisely at the trail itself. The data was frustratingly imprecise. Cell towers covered wide areas, especially in rural regions. The data proved Drummond's phone was somewhere in a 20-mile radius that included Black Ridge Trail, the service road where Vernon Hayes had seen someone matching Michael's description, and the general direction of Ridgeline Canyon. But it wasn't specific enough to place him at any exact location. Lieutenant Brennan laid out the circumstantial evidence. Drummond had motive resentment toward Michael for his role in the termination. He had owned a vehicle matching the description of the dark green SUV seen near Michael the day he disappeared. His cell phone placed him in the general area. He had no alibi. But Lieutenant Brennan also knew what prosecutors would say. None of this was enough. Motive, opportunity, and circumstantial connections weren't sufficient for a murder charge, especially when the cause of death itself was undetermined. She pressed Drummond in a second interview, presenting the evidence they had. Drummond's lawyer advised him not to answer, but Drummond ignored the advice, insisting on defending himself. He admitted he had been in the area that weekend. He used to hike those trails himself when he lived locally, even after being fired. He admitted he might have driven past the Black Ridge trailhead that morning, but he denied ever seeing Michael, denied ever speaking to him, denied any involvement in his death. His tone was bitter, defensive, but not necessarily deceptive. The investigation hit another wall when forensic analysis of Michael's remains failed to yield any DNA evidence from another person. The bones had been too degraded, exposed too long. If Drummond or anyone else had been involved in Michael's death, the physical evidence had been erased by 8 years of weather and animal activity. Prosecutors reviewed the case file extensively. Their conclusion was what Lieutenant Brennan had feared. The evidence was entirely circumstantial and insufficient for criminal charges. To prove murder, they would need to establish beyond reasonable doubt that Drummond had killed Michael Torres. They couldn't even prove conclusively that Michael had been murdered. The forensic report listed cause of death as undetermined. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without a clearer timeline, the case couldn't go to trial. The decision was devastating for the Torres family. Lieutenant Brennan met with Elena, Claire, and David privately to explain the situation. They sat in the same conference room at the sheriff's office where they had received the news about Michael's remains being identified, and listened as the lieutenant explained that despite their best efforts, despite having a strong suspect, they couldn't make an arrest. Elena's response was quiet fury. 8 years of not knowing, 8 years of hoping for answers, and now they were being told that the person who likely killed her husband would face no consequences. Claire, now a police cadet herself, understood the legal limitations intellectually, but felt them as a personal betrayal. David said nothing, just stood and walked out of the room. The story exploded in the media. "Suspect identified but not charged in Torres' death," read the headlines. Kyle Drummond's name was released publicly, and he became the target of intense scrutiny and speculation. Online communities that had followed the case for years dissected every detail of his background, his firing from the school district, his connection to Michael. Public opinion was divided. Many believed Drummond was guilty and that the justice system had failed. Others argued that the evidence was too weak, that investigators were desperate to close the case and had fixated on the wrong person. Drummond hired a more aggressive lawyer and stopped cooperating with investigators entirely. He gave a single interview to a local news station, proclaiming his innocence and accusing the sheriff's office of harassment. He claimed he was being scapegoated because of his past issues at the school, that investigators had tunnel vision and were ignoring other possibilities. Lieutenant Brennan knew he might be right about the tunnel vision. She had seen it happen before, investigators becoming so convinced of a suspect's guilt that they stopped looking at alternatives. She forced herself to consider other scenarios. What if Drummond was telling the truth? What if someone else had been involved? She reviewed the case file again, looking for leads they might have missed, other people who might have had reason to harm Michael. But there was nothing, no other suspects, no other motives, no other explanations that fit the evidence as well as Drummond did. And yet, without proof, the case remained in a terrible limbo, not quite solved, not quite unsolved, just suspended in a space where everyone believed they knew what had happened but couldn't prove it. The months following the decision not to prosecute were agony for everyone involved. The Torres family struggled with the knowledge that they would never see justice. The community argued about Drummond's guilt or innocence. And Kyle Drummond continued his life in Oregon, a free man under a permanent cloud of suspicion. 4 months after the decision not to charge Kyle Drummond, Lieutenant Sarah Brennan received a letter at the sheriff's office. It arrived in a standard white envelope, addressed to her by name, with no return address. The postmark showed it had been mailed from a town in Washington state, about 200 miles north. She opened it carefully, photographing the envelope first, following protocol in case it turned out to be evidence. Inside was a single handwritten page, the writing small and cramped, done in blue ballpoint pen. The message was brief and chilling. "He knew too much about what we found up there. He wouldn't stay quiet. Some trails are meant to stay hidden. The canyon keeps its secrets, and so do the people who need them kept. You're looking at the wrong person." What Michael found wasn't about revenge, it was about protection. Follow the money that doesn't exist, the permits that were never filed, the land that was supposed to stay empty. He was going to talk. We couldn't let him. There was no signature, no identifying information. The letter was vague enough to be worthless as evidence, but specific enough to be deeply unsettling. Lieutenant Brennan read it 3 times, then called in the forensic team to process it for fingerprints, DNA, anything that might identify the sender. The results came back negative. The letter had been handled carefully, likely with gloves. The paper was standard printer paper available anywhere. The pen was a common Bic. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive. It could have been disguised or naturally irregular. The content of the letter suggested something investigators hadn't seriously considered, that Michael's death wasn't personal revenge but was connected to something he had discovered, something illegal happening in the forest. What we found up there implied criminal activity. Permits that were never filed and land that was supposed to stay empty suggested illegal development or resource extraction. Lieutenant Brennan assembled her team and began investigating this new angle. They contacted the Forest Service and requested records of all permits, surveys, and reported illegal activities in the region over the past decade. They looked for patterns of poaching, illegal logging, marijuana growing operations, anything that might fit the letter's implications. They interviewed park rangers and longtime locals about rumors of illegal activity in the backcountry. The investigation yielded dozens of small incidents over the years: illegal campsites, unlicensed hunting, minor vandalism, but nothing significant enough to suggest an organized operation that someone would kill to protect. They found no evidence of large-scale illegal logging or mining in the area where Michael's remains were discovered. No marijuana grows, no meth labs, nothing that would typically generate the kind of violence described in the letter. They re-examined Michael's deleted emails and found messages with more scrutiny, looking for any references to discoveries or concerns about illegal activity. The vague statements, "can't keep quiet, need to figure out what to do," could fit this theory, but they were too ambiguous to confirm it. They interviewed Michael's hiking friends again, asking specifically if he had ever mentioned finding anything unusual in the forest. No one recalled any such conversations. The letter might have been genuine, a confession or warning from someone with actual knowledge. Or it might have been a cruel hoax, someone who had followed the case in the media and wanted to inject themselves into the investigation. Without additional evidence, there was no way to verify its authenticity. Investigators pursued the lead for 6 weeks, exhausting every angle, but found nothing concrete. The letter remained a tantalizing mystery, a possible explanation that couldn't be proven or disproven. Eventually, the resources dedicated to the investigation had to be scaled back. Other cases demanded attention. The Torres case, once again, began to cool. Kyle Drummond remained the most likely suspect in Lieutenant Brennan's mind, but she couldn't completely dismiss the possibility that the letter writer was telling the truth, that Michael had been killed for reasons unrelated to Drummond's resentment. The uncertainty was maddening. The case was officially classified as a suspicious death with no arrest. The file remained open, technically active, but without new evidence there was nothing more investigators could do. Lieutenant Brennan kept the case file on her desk as a reminder, as a personal failure she couldn't quite accept. Michael Torres's remains were finally released to the family in early spring, nearly a year after they had been discovered. A memorial service was held at the same church where Michael and Elena had been married 27 years earlier. The sanctuary was packed with hundreds of people, former students who remembered Mr. Torres's enthusiasm for maps and geography trivia, colleagues who had worked alongside him for years, community members who had searched for him 8 years ago, and strangers who had followed the case and felt compelled to pay respects. Elena stood at the podium in a black dress, her face hollow, with grief that had been stretched across nearly a decade. Claire and David sat in the front row, holding each other. Elena's eulogy was brief. She spoke about Michael's love for teaching, his terrible jokes that made their children groan, his Saturday morning hikes that he called his therapy. And then she spoke directly to whoever was responsible for his death, her voice steady despite the tears. "I don't know if you're here today. I don't know if you'll ever see this or hear these words. But I need you to know that Michael was loved. He was a good man, a devoted father, a teacher who changed lives. Whatever happened on that trail, whatever reason you had, you took him from people who needed him. You stole 8 years where we couldn't even grieve properly because we didn't know if he was alive or dead. If you have any humanity left, if there's any part of you that feels remorse, please come forward. Please give us the truth. We deserve at least that much." The church was silent except for muffled crying. Elena walked back to her seat, and the service continued, but her words hung in the air, a plea that would likely never be answered. Claire graduated from the police academy 2 months later, finishing at the top of her class. She accepted a position with a county sheriff's office in a neighboring region, specifically requesting assignment to investigations. She told her mother she wanted to help other families find answers, to work cold cases, to be the kind of investigator who never gave up. Elena knew the real reason. Claire was still searching for her father, still trying to understand, still hoping that somehow, somewhere, there were answers waiting to be found. David slowly, painfully, began the process of healing. He started therapy, worked through the anger and grief he had buried for years. He began speaking publicly about his experience, appearing at support groups for families of missing persons, sharing his story in the hope that it might help someone else feel less alone. The trauma would always be part of him, but he was learning to carry it differently. The Black Ridge Trail, where Michael Torres had last been seen 8 years ago, was marked with a small bronze plaque mounted on a rock near the trailhead. In memory of Michael Torres, beloved teacher, father, and friend, missing, the 14th of October 2016. Found, September 2024. May all who walk this trail find peace. Hikers stopped to read it, to pause for a moment before heading into the forest. Some left flowers. Others posted photos on social media with captions about remembering the teacher who vanished. The trail had become a memorial, a reminder that the wilderness was beautiful but could also be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with weather or wildlife. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan kept the Torres case file in her office, in a specific spot on her desk where she saw it every day. She pulled it out periodically, reviewed the evidence, looked for something she might have missed. Occasionally, new tips came in. Someone claimed to have seen Michael in another state. Someone else reported finding items in the forest they thought might be connected. Brennan followed up on every lead, no matter how unlikely. None of them went anywhere. She maintained a list of similar unsolved cases in the region, still looking for patterns. The 2 other men who had disappeared years ago, Robert Chen and James Rucker, their files, sat alongside Michael's. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection, but she couldn't find it. 3 men, all experienced hikers, all vanished in remote areas, all dead under ambiguous circumstances. Coincidence, or something darker? Kyle Drummond continued living in Oregon, working his warehouse job, existing under a cloud of permanent suspicion. No charges were ever filed. He never spoke publicly about the case again after that single interview. To investigators, he remained the most likely suspect. To the public, he was either a man who got away with murder or an innocent person whose life had been destroyed by false accusations. The anonymous letter writer never contacted authorities again. The investigation into possible illegal activity in the forest yielded nothing substantial. That particular thread of the mystery simply faded, unresolved. Years would pass. People would move on. Other tragedies would capture the community's attention, but the Torres family would never fully move on. Elena would continue living in the house where Michael had kissed her goodbye that October morning, surrounded by memories and unanswered questions. Claire would work cold cases with an intensity her colleagues found both admirable and concerning, driven by the unsolved mystery of her father's death. David would carry the trauma of loss without closure, learning to live with it but never quite escaping it. The mystery of what really happened to Michael Torres in those final hours remained exactly that, a mystery. Did Kyle Drummond confront him on the trail, force him into a vehicle, and kill him in the remote canyon in an act of revenge? Did Michael discover something illegal in the forest and get killed to protect that secret? Was there some third explanation, something no one had even considered? The evidence suggested murder, but couldn't prove it. The suspects suggested motives, but couldn't be charged. The circumstances suggested intention, but couldn't be definitively determined. The case existed in the gray space between solved and unsolved, where theories abounded but certainty remained elusive. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Brennan would eventually retire after 30 years in law enforcement, but she would never forget the geography teacher who vanished on a Saturday morning and turned up 8 years later in a canyon 7 miles from where he should have been. On her last day before retirement, she passed the Torres case file to a younger detective, briefing them on every detail, every lead, every dead end. She told them to keep looking, to never give up, because somewhere out there, someone knew the truth. And so the file remained open, technically active, waiting for the breakthrough that might never come. The Black Ridge Trail continued to welcome hikers every weekend, beautiful and indifferent, keeping whatever secrets the forest held. Michael Torres's memorial plaque weathered slowly in the mountain air, a permanent question mark carved into the landscape. His family learned to live with the not knowing, joined that terrible community of people for whom tragedy had no clean ending. They carried their grief and their questions forward into whatever future they could build, haunted by the ghost of October 14th, 2016, the day Michael Torres walked into the forest and never walked out, the day that would never make sense, the day that ended one mystery and began another, that would stretch across 8 years and beyond. The case remained cold, the questions remained unanswered, and somewhere, perhaps, someone knew exactly what had happened on that trail, in that canyon, on that autumn day when a good man disappeared and a family's life shattered into pieces that would never quite fit back together. But that truth, if it existed, stayed hidden, buried as deeply as Michael Torres himself had been, waiting in the shadows of the forest, a secret the wilderness refused to give up.